They said Miss Essie never had children of her own, that she poured her whole life into cleaning up after other people's kids. Kids who grew up and never remembered her name. But what they didn't know is that she did raise a child, just not one anyone expected. It was the summer of 1962, Monroe, Alabama. Heat stuck to your skin like sin, and the town whispered more than it spoke. Miss Essie worked for the Davenports, a wealthy white family with money, manners, and more secrets than silver. She scrubbed their floors, cooked their meals, and kept her mouth shut. That's how a black woman survived back then, until one evening. Everything changed. Mrs. Davenport came down the stairs holding a newborn baby, red-faced and wailing. She didn't say a word, just handed the child to Miss Essie like she was passing a dish rag. "Take it," she said. "He ain't ours no more." And then she turned and walked away. No tears, no explanation. Miss Essie stood there frozen, holding a child that didn't belong to her. But the weight of that baby in her arms, so light, so breakable, it told her what to do before her mind could catch up. She rocked him gently and whispered, "You safe now, baby?" But she knew deep down he wasn't, not in this town, not in that skin, because the baby was white. And Miss Essie, she was about to break every unspoken rule the South had ever written. But love don't care about rules. It just cares about holding on. That night, she made the choice that would define the rest of her life. She didn't tell a soul, not the other maids, not the neighbors, not even her sister down in Mobile. That baby would be hers. And nobody could ever know. But secrets, no matter how carefully you hide them, have a way of rising to the surface, and one day, hers would erupt like thunder. Miss Essie named him Samuel. Not Sammy, not Sam. Samuel, like the prophet in the Bible. She said if he was gonna grow up, in a world that didn't want him, he'd need a name that carried weight. She tucked him in every night in the back room of her tiny shotgun house, bathed him in the same tin tub she used herself, fed him mashed sweet potatoes when she barely had enough to feed her own mouth, and every time he looked up at her with those big blue eyes, she forgot that he wasn't hers by blood. But the world never forgot. She couldn't take Samuel outside in the daylight, couldn't carry him on the bus, couldn't risk anyone asking too many questions. Folks in Monroe didn't ask much out loud, but they noticed. And eyes were just as dangerous as words. So she told people he was her boss lady's child, that she was just watching him for a while. People nodded and moved on. But some didn't buy it, especially Miss Clara from down the road, who once said with a smirk, "White folks don't give up nothing that clean unless it's broke." Essie kept her head low, her heart high. She sang to Samuel in the evenings, old spirituals passed down from her grandmother, songs soaked in sorrow but stitched with hope. He'd gurgle and hum along, not knowing what the words meant, but feeling their warmth just the same. As the weeks turned into months, the baby started to change. He learned her scent, her voice, the rhythm of her heartbeat. To him, she wasn't the help. She was Mama. But Monroe was changing too. The civil rights movement was knocking on Alabama's door, and not everyone welcomed the sound. White men were getting angrier. Black folks were getting braver. And the air started to feel heavy, like something was about to snap. One morning, as Essie hung laundry on the line, a sheriff's car rolled by slow, too slow. And inside, Deputy Ray Hollis squinted at her with that look, the one that meant he knew something, or was about to. She clutched Samuel close and whispered, "Don't worry, baby. Mama's got you." But her voice trembled, because the truth was, Mama didn't know how much longer she could keep them both safe. Weeks passed. Miss Essie barely slept. She'd keep a candle burning by the window, ears sharp for footsteps, for knocks that came after dark, for the sound of that sheriff's engine rumbling down her street again. Samuel was crawling now, clumsy and curious, always tugging at her skirt or banging pots like they were drums. He'd laugh, wild and free, like he didn't know he wasn't supposed to exist in that house, in that town, in that skin. One night, just after sunset, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not rushed, just intentional. Essie froze, Samuel still in her arms. She cracked the door. There stood Mrs. Davenport. Same perfect dress, same pearls, same cold, unreadable eyes. She didn't look at Essie. She looked at the child, at Samuel. "He looks healthy," she said, voice like ice water. "You've done a good job." Essie swallowed hard. Her hands tightened around Samuel like armor. Mrs. Davenport sighed and said, "You need to stop taking him outside. People are talking." Essie stepped out onto the porch. "You gave him to me," she said, quiet but steady. "You didn't ask what I'd do. You didn't care." Mrs. Davenport blinked. "I still don't, but I won't have this becoming a situation. If anyone finds out, it's both our heads." And then, without warning, she turned and walked away, heels clicking down. The wooden steps, like punctuation, marks on a sentence that wasn't finished. Essie stood there, the wind wrapping around her like a warning. Samuel whimpered in her arms. That night, she packed a small bag, a few diapers, a worn blanket, a photograph of her mother. And just before sunrise, she boarded a bus to Birmingham. She didn't know anyone there, didn't have a job lined up, but she knew one thing for sure. If she stayed in Monroe, Samuel wouldn't make it to his second birthday. The ride was long, the passengers mostly quiet. Some gave her looks, some didn't bother. She sat by the window, Samuel asleep on her chest, her hand resting gently on his back. She watched the trees blur past and whispered, "You gon' grow up where nobody knows what we are, where maybe, just maybe, they let us be." But fate has a funny way of finding people, because someone on that bus recognized her. And they were headed back to Monroe with a story the whole town would soon be talking about. By the time Miss Essie stepped off the bus in Birmingham, the sun was high, the streets humming with strangers, and her name was already circling Monroe like smoke. She rented a room in a crumbling boarding house on the east side, run by a quiet widow named Miss Thelma who didn't ask questions. Just handed her the key and said, "No noise, no man, no mess." Essie nodded. "Ain't here for none of that," she replied, holding Samuel close. "Just need a place where nobody's watching." But even in Birmingham, eyes had a way of finding her. People stared too long when she bought formula. Clerks asked questions when she filled out forms. A black woman with a white baby? It didn't make sense to them. But she never explained. Just moved faster, looked down, kept going. Years passed. Samuel grew. Brown curls, light skin, eyes that never lost their wonder. He called her Mama without hesitation. Not once did he ask why his reflection didn't match hers. Essie worked 2 jobs, cleaning a diner before dawn, ironing shirts for a dry cleaner after sunset. Every cent went into a box beneath the floorboard. "For Samuel's schooling," she'd whisper, like it was a prayer. She taught him hymns, manners, Black history, told him he was special, but never told him why, not yet. But on his 9th birthday, everything unraveled. He brought home a school photo, smiling, beaming, holding a sign that read, "My Family Heritage Project." And he'd drawn a tree, a big one. But on every branch was her face. Not a single white face. No Davenports. No birth parents. Just Essie, his only truth. She felt her chest tighten. Tears filled her eyes, not from pride, but fear, because she knew the world was going to ask questions soon. He was getting too old, too curious, too visible. And then came the knock. Not at night this time, in broad daylight. Miss Thelma answered it. A man in a tan coat, notebook in hand, said he was a journalist from Montgomery. Said he'd heard about a woman raising a white child in secret since the 60s. Miss Thelma called Essie to the front porch. She stepped out, apron still tied, flower on her hands. The man looked up and asked gently, "Is it true?" Essie didn't flinch. She looked straight at him and said, "I ain't hiding no more." The story went public within days. Headlines like, "The woman who raised a child the world told her to give up." Some folks praised her, called her a hero. Others called her a thief. But Miss Essie didn't care about the noise. She only cared that Samuel knew, so she sat him down. Told him everything, how he came to her arms, how she risked it all, how she chose him. When she finished, Samuel didn't cry, didn't pull away. He just said, "So you're not my blood?" She smiled through tears. "No, baby. I'm your heart." And that was all he ever needed to know.